Okay, I am Sarah Brumfield. I'm here today with my partner, Ben. Together we run From the Page. From the Page is a crowdsourcing platform used by libraries, archives, museums, historians to transcribe historic documents, but also to index them, to correct OCR, to identify photographs, to create metadata. And what that means in the context of today's webinar is we think a lot about accessibility, about metadata, about text that comes out of kind of archival resources. And so with that framing, we've been doing a lot of experiments and learning to use ChatGPT for our work and thinking about how we could apply it to our systems. And that's what we're going to talk to you about today, is kind of what we've learned, what we're playing with, what we think the possibilities are, and we're going to give you lots and lots of examples. Go to the next slide, please. So our basic agenda is we're going to start with prompt writing strategies. That's the basic way you interact with ChatGPT. We've got a lot of hints and tricks and ways to frame how you write prompts. Then we're going to give you a number of library and archives use cases and the experiments that we've been running with our material and with some of our customers' materials, or just other things that are kind of in all of our ecosystems. We'll take questions at the end, and we'll have, we'll address everything we can with what we know so far. We've been doing, a lot of research and becoming experts on this, but it moves so fast. There's a lot of things we still don't know. And then if we have time at the end, we are willing to do some live experiments. So be thinking about the types of tasks or questions or work you might like to use ChatGPT to do. And we'll work with you and we'll do it live, and we'll see together what we can come up with. Okay, next slide, please. So prompt engineering is the phrase that folks use to talk about interacting with these large language models, which is what ChatGPT is built on top of. And it's basically how you steer the ship. So it's just what you type into ChatGPT, but the goal is to guide the AI with very clear instructions. So if you write better prompts, you'll have more relevant results, higher quality results, they'll be more accurate, and fundamentally, they'll be more useful. Context, like everything you wrap around, everything that you feed the model, the ChatGPT interface, everything that you set up as part of what you're asking, the more of that you can provide, the more relevant, accurate, and personal the results you'll get. So maybe that's information from an article or a blog post. I'm trying to do this. Here's what I found about it. I think this is important. Help me come up with a step-by-step plan. Or if you're writing an email or a blog post or something, adding, here's a personal story I've written that I would like to use for introducing this. You include that. Custom data. I know this is the facts that I want to include, or this is what I've discovered in my research or in my questionnaire or my survey. Any of that level of context, the more you can provide, the better the results you'll get. So this is something really, really important. I see a lot of people, when they start interacting with ChatGPT, they treat it like a search engine, because that's what we've all been trained to do when we're looking for information online. And that's not how this works. Next slide, please. So chat it's a dialogue, right? When you start asking a question and you give it as much context as you can, you don't actually lose that. That stays around, and you can ask follow-up questions. You can refine the answer to get something that's, like, this is not quite right. Give it to me this way, or can you expand on that, or can you summarize that, and so you don't lose the context of this whole interaction. That actually all is input into the next stage of this conversation. So you can clarify, you can iterate. And I would encourage you to do that and to start doing that more and more and more, because it's not a search engine. This particular hint, which is give it a specific role, is one of the most powerful prompt strategies there is out there. So for a project I'm working on, I'm using this first bullet: you're a historian analyzing the transcription of a primary source document. So what that does is it gives the large language model context, right? Context, context, context. And it really narrows down the focus and kind of gets it to access the most relevant information and kind of frameworks for thinking about things. So some other role examples: you are a software developer, you are a digital librarian, you're an archivist, you are a metadata librarian. These all might be useful in the type of tasks and jobs that we're talking about. To me, this is almost the same thing, but it's a little bit taking it a step further, which is give it a specific persona. So in addition to just saying you're a historian, you could say you're a historian of antebellum. That's not the word where we use any word. What do our 19th century historian with a focus on
labor relations, and you have taught and researched for 20 years, and you have a PhD from here. You could keep going and keep going and keep going, and all of this gives you more style in what comes out the other end, because you're giving it more clues to what you're looking for. One of the other things that a lot of people do, especially with like generating writing, is in the style of. So one of the very first ones I saw was in the style of Shakespeare, right? You could please write me a poem in the style of Shakespeare. Those are actually fascinating and really fun to play with. But if you're using this in a professional context, I think it's more interesting to say, in the style of Oprah Winfrey, if you're trying to be enthusiastic and curious and positive. Or for me, I try to be a thoughtful technologist who really looks at how technology impacts the world. So I might say something like in the style of Bill Gates, who I have a lot of admiration for. And all of those things influence the style and tone of the results that you get back. When you're doing kind of hard problem solving, this is especially true with kind of mathy style things or things that have complicated many step processes, is prompts like, let's talk about this in a step-by-step way, or let's think step by step. And what you're doing is you're prompting the model to kind of break down any answer it would give you into clear step, 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 step. And it makes it easier for us, the humans, to understand, because we're kind of forcing the model to think more in a more kind of component-based way. I do find that these large language models are very wordy. And so if you don't use prompts like this, sometimes you get like very long paragraphs of text out. And we all know that's not necessarily how we like to learn. Like, we like to think in kind of snippets and look at bullets on a slide rather than, And a lot of the text can come out as boilerplate or like management speak. It can be not great stuff.
Yeah, blathering or, yeah. So this is an example that was one of the first interactions I had with ChatGPT, where I'm like, oh, this is really powerful. We had run into a problem 3 months earlier where someone uploaded images from the page, and like half of them were showing up hot pink. And we're like, why is this happening? And we eventually solved it by having the digital librarian recompress them slightly differently, but we really didn't know what was causing the problem. And then it came up again. And we're like, oh, this problem again? And so we'd already done all this research and we really hadn't come up with an answer. So I asked ChatGPT. And so one of the things, this is a pretty short prompt, but one of the things to look at and think about is how many pieces of context are in the question. Images, compressed with image magic, which is the tool we use, turn pink when viewed on Firefox. And then any ideas why, kind of suggesting that there are possible many ideas, not just one that might be happening. And we got back this answer. And the very first one was a concept we hadn't investigated yet. And it actually turned out to be the right answer. It was the color profile that was a problem. And you can see that I kind of kept this as a dialogue. I'm like, okay, how do I fix it, right? How do I tell Image Magic to keep that original color profile? And it actually gave me the answer to that. I ended up not using it because I went back to the digital librarian. I'm like, hey, what color profile did you use? She was like, oh, this one, but we could do this one instead. I'm like, yeah, let's try that. And that solved it.
So I think this is kind of just an example of where we're seeing, I mean, it was so fast, and it was almost like magic. And that's what's kind of amazing about some of these tools. Asking for a very clear task or objective is another strategy that I would encourage you to use anytime you're interacting with ChatGPT. So you can specify the response format. So things like the bullet down here, create a table of options and their pros and cons, or draft an email, or 3 bullet points. Those are very specific formats of things that you're looking for. You can also specify length. A lot of times we get really long answers out, so you can ask for 1 to 300 word summary of. You can influence tone by asking things like, in words a 5-year-old can understand, or for a high school student, or in plain English is one that I've used. So, thinking about what you want out the other end and asking for it helps you get it. So our next example is I was doing some health research. I had found this paper on the NIH's website. I don't have any background in biology and medicine, and so I asked it to put this paragraph from this paper in plain English, and it did, and it still was really hard to read and understand. And then I could keep asking questions about the material in it, and that I found it very useful. So. ChatGPT will mimic your style. So if you want it to use particular technical language, use that technical language written in the way you want it to use it in your prompt. If you want it to be more formal, ask very formal questions. I tend to be very polite when I interact with ChatGPT, and I feel like I get pretty formal responses out. You can also steer and iterate style, this idea that these interactions are dialogues, right? So you can get one answer and then you can iterate it, make it more informal. Please rewrite this to be more positive without being stereotypical, or even use alliteration. So this is an example, next click, of which I used in our last webinar on how the large language models work, but where we had just a simple transcript of an interview that we wanted to use some of the material for in a newsletter we sent out. So I asked ChatGPT to rewrite this as a newsletter instead of as an interview. And I got this out of it, which was very clear and formal and well-structured, and actually matched the material that we fed it. It was a little bit too formal for me, so I asked for a more informal version, which started with "hey there" and ended with "thanks for listening, catch you later," which we would never say. But between these, and I think if I had iterated 3 more times and kind of combined the first one and the second one, we would have gotten where we, to something that was very close to what we would have written if we had done it ourselves. Instead, we kind of took this last one and then we tweaked it and did the editing ourselves, which I think is fine too, because a lot of times what you need is just a good starting point.
This was a good example of iteration, though.
Yes. And now, but that was like 3 months ago, and now I'm much better at iterating. One of the other things that I think is super powerful is having a dialogue with ChatGPT. So using keywords like think out loud, or debate, or discuss, or reflect. Those are powerful keywords that can get you a broader set of responses. I have seen a lot and done some work around kind of coaching and some kind of, I'm going to call this mild therapy, because again, I'm an engineer, not a therapist, so I'm not going to pretend like I know what's going on here. But because these large language models have been trained on so much of the open web, that means that they have a lot of the information that's out there about, what people say about parenting. What are 3 strategies for getting my kid to sleep through the night? And okay, well, I've tried that one. Can you give me 3 other ones? Or this is the problem I ran into. And you can have these dialogues, and it keeps the context and it keeps coming back, and you can kind of refine what you need by asking more questions. The example I put here, I was experimenting with using it for, I was feeling down because a customer had downgraded their from the page subscription. And I ended up with the sort of words that a friend would tell you, which is, this is just what business is like. It doesn't mean they don't like you. And here's maybe some strategies for finding out what's going on and thinking about the future and what you're going to do. And, nothing brilliant, but because this is a machine, in some ways it's easier to be vulnerable. You're not wasting, your partner's time listening to you be angsty. But you can also, I've seen some really cool things here where you can actually ask it to use different therapeutic modalities, which I don't know anything about, but if you do, you can actually prompt it to have a dialogue with you along the ways you want. You can also use that role-playing idea to say, okay, you're a night nurse who specializes in getting 6-month-old babies to sleep through the night. What would you tell me about this particular situation? And so you're prompting it to act as an expert and use expertise that it's found that kind of represents that expert's viewpoint. These large language models lie because their job is to produce plausible text based on statistics. So it's like autocorrect on steroids. And so it's going to give you the next word in a sequence that makes sense, but is not necessarily true. So we've found that there are some ways that you can minimize this impact. Doesn't mean that it's going to guarantee you correct output, but what it does is it puts some guardrails on what you're asking ChatGPT to do. And so it kind of reduces the chance that some of that's going to happen. So one of the projects I'm working on, I have this, is if the answer cannot be determined or inferred from the page text, please respond, I am sorry, I do not know. Like, you're very clear, here's your out. Don't go make stuff up, right? Because if you don't say that, then it probably will go make stuff up. Only choose from the following list of tags. That's from an example Ben's going to give in a couple more slides. One or more of, because if you ask for 3 things, it will come up with 3 things, but one or more, you kind of giving it the option to not come up with 3 things. As we mentioned earlier, it tends to kind of bloviate and have a lot of words, so you can start limiting, things like summaries or emails or things by giving it a word count or a word range to work within. So let's break down an example. I've got 2 of them here. So this one is kind of a standard style example from some training that I did online. So acting as a registered dietitian with a passion for fitness and using the information I provided, design a meal plan for a 50-year-old male living with controlled diabetes and practicing intermittent fasting, blah, blah, blah. Present the information in a grid form using an inspirational tone. Okay, but breaking that down, the first thing you see in blue is acting as a registered dietitian, right? So that is that role play piece, which is really, really powerful. The second thing in orange, passion for fitness, is just add a little bit more personality to that role, right? And also that word fitness is going to skew things, in the fitness way instead of a pure eating way. Context, all the yellow is context, 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 right? And the more you provide, the better results you get. And then the green is where you're asking for a very specific output. So the output here is a meal plan in grid form in an inspirational tone. So that is kind of an example of how you structure one of these prompts. But let's look at it for more archival style information. So this is a project I'm working on. We're actually building a chat bot around some primary source documents that we transcribe on from the page. And so we get that role I mentioned earlier. You're a historian analyzing the transcription of a primary source document. We get a whole bunch of context. So this is a diary by this person who is the owner of a tobacco farm in Pittsylvania County, Virginia, from these years. And then we also say, you're going to get this page of text and a question. And this is an interesting strategy that you can use with ChatGPT, where you use these square brackets and you basically are doing substitutions. So if you have work that you do over and over and over again, it would be reasonable to put this in a cheat sheet somewhere, and you copy and paste it in, and then you add today's text and today's question. And you can put that, you kind of append that to the end with the label on the top of it. And then the output specifications, answer questions based on the page and what can be inferred from it. And if you can't answer and for it, please respond, I am sorry, I do not know. So that's kind of those guardrails again. And then there's the orange, please answer pleasantly and accurately, which is more kind of persona and tone. So one of my first, so that project is kind of an archival example, but I've got some more examples from the same primary source document of using ChatGPT to extract entities. So, we do a lot of work with documentary editors, and in from the page, you can mark up transcribed text to mark up entities, people, places, things, weather, crops, whatever it is in your document. So this example, let's go to the next slide. I gave ChatGPT a page out of this diary, and I asked it to identify the people named in the following historical diary entries. And it was interesting because it came back with a list of the people, and this was accurate. I went through and double checked it. I may not have the full response on here, but and it actually told me who the people were within the context of this diary entry. But really all I wanted was something that maybe I could turn into, something that would help us find people in the documents. So I asked it to iterate and just give me a list of the people's names. So I thought that had a lot. I think this style of thing has a lot of potential. And one of the interesting things is, so ChatGPT is a web interface that you type stuff into, but anything you can do there, you can do programmatically, right? So it's something, we're doing experiments to see, okay, we have transcribed text. What can we get out of it to help with findability or with metadata creation, things like that. Go to the next slide. So same diary entry, I asked, what about places? Because I think places are interesting, and I get, this list of places. I don't know whether they're actually useful or not, but it's interesting that it successfully identified all of the places in those diary entries. This I thought was super interesting. So one of the things that AI in general is good at and has been doing for about at least a decade is classification. Does this image have something in it or not, right? There's a lot of that. In fact, if you probably see that with some of the CAPTCHA stuff. Does this, is there a crosswalk in this image, or which squares have crosswalks? And that's training data for doing similar sorts of image classification tasks. But we can do classification based on words. So that same entry I showed a couple slides ago, I'm like, okay, are there any enslaved people mentioned in these entries? And the model was able to say, yes, look, there's this mention of a Negro man, Isaacs, who passed away, and there was a coffin being made for him. And it actually justified why it picked Isaacs out. I think this is really interesting because a lot of what the archives and special collections we're talking to, they're like, we're looking for ways to bring untold stories to the forefront. And how do you find them, right? and a lot of it starts with transcribing, because it's mentions like this, where you have one sentence in a page that might be relevant, but being able to say, these pages you should go look at because they have interesting things in them, I think becomes really powerful. So Ben's going to talk some more about this classification as a task.
Right, so I'd like to go into a couple of very kind of real world examples of things that we need and that I think a lot of libraries and archives need, and some experiments that we ran with the help of a research assistant, Isabella Barton, to kind of determine how best to make this work, and is it even a possible task? So one of the challenges that we have from the page, since we are trying to connect volunteers with projects, is to come up with a kind of directory that lets people find the material that they are interested in, regardless of how it has been described by the institution. So I want to show 3 examples of different projects and the information that we have that was added by the archives or special collections. So here is a project that is encouraging people to identify photographs of parks in Indianapolis. And here's the information that we have. Got a lot of great stuff about Indianapolis here, but there's also some instructions involved, right? There's a little bit of clutter. You might not be able to find this in a full text search, but this is one of the things we'd like to classify. Here's a separate project that is run out of, I think, Queens College. No, sorry, Western. And it's essentially a book history project, right? It is a handwritten catalog into someone's private library. Does it say book history anywhere? Not really. Does it say library science anywhere? Not really. This might be kind of like, unless you were looking for Bishop Hellmuth, you might have trouble finding this project. Here's yet another project. This is at Carleton, and you see this is interesting because it is in Chinese as well as in English. And it is describing, you know, here's exactly what's in this. But again, there's kind of this assumption that someone visiting will have the context of knowing something about Carleton rather than being a complete stranger. So we want to come up with a set of tags, and we already have come up with a set of about 100 different tags that we can use to tag projects. But having gotten those, how do we apply those tags to these projects? So our question is, can we automatically tag these collections based on descriptions that were added by the institution for their own purposes, without the idea of making this material findable and kind of a large multi-institution platform? So we have controlled vocabulary of tags that we've already created. And our idea was to feed ChatGPT the list of tags to use and the information that we have about each collection, the title of the collection and the description of the collection. Then we'd look at the tags that it created and compare that against a set of tags that were created by a trained archivist who was doing the same project. So let's see how it did. So for the Indianapolis Parks and Recs, ChatGPT chose parks, photographs and images, 19th century. The trained archivist came up with only 2 tags. The interesting thing about this is that 19th century is wrong, right? 19th century is almost certainly incorrect. However, parks and photographs, that's exactly what we had. So we've got 1 false positive, but the rest is pretty good. So this is definitely a nice starting point. For the Bishop Hellmuth Library catalog, ChatGPT said 19th century, that is probably correct. Book history as a topic, and university. So the archivist who classified these didn't actually use book history. This is a case in which I think, 19th century is the same between both of them. I think the ChatGPT response was actually a little bit better. Then we did the same thing with the Carleton example. ChatGPT did a reasonably good job. It identified China, it identified 20th century, it identified photographs and images. It didn't pick up on travel, which definitely is something that people who are interested in travel diaries and travel descriptions might be interested in this project. But again, the archivist didn't pick up on China. So, this I feel like is about even.
Do you think any of these, I know some of the experiments we ran, ChatGPT sort of made up some tags that were not in the set? Do you think?
We'll get there.
Okay,
we'll get there.
Okay.
So let's talk about the prompt. This is the 3rd iteration of the prompt that we used. Pick 3 tags from the following list. This is the original. The original prompt was pick 3 tags from the list to describe a collection with this title and description. We gave it the list. You will see that we had to modify this prompt twice with pick tags only from the list. right? Because it kept choosing tags that they weren't bad tags, but they weren't in the list at all. And we had to go through a third time and say, do not give me any tags that isn't in the list, right? So you have to reiterate and reiterate to keep it from just kind of winging it.
Except that winging it was not terrible. Like, that's the problem. It wasn't on our list.
Yes,
But
some of the tags that were suggested that weren't on our list were actually decent,
Good,
right?
yeah.
It identified Vietnam War. That was correct, but a lot of the rest of it was really not what you're after, right? If you've got a controlled vocabulary, you wanted to use the controlled vocabulary. So again, we think that this actually could work. We think that we can use this. It does need some review, but we think it's a great starting point for coming up with tags for these disparate collections. So success, I think. So let's talk about a second experiment that we thought was pretty successful. ChatGPT is really good at paraphrasing material because it's good at language. So what are opportunities, what are reasons to paraphrase primary source material? Well, one reason is, so primary sources that we generally transcribe verbatim presents problems for access. So here's an example from the same Virginia tobacco farm diary that we were talking about earlier. You can see the diarist is using a lot of abbreviations. These are not complete sentences. And we can read this, right? We can look through, especially if we've read enough of it, we can kind of figure out what's going on here. But if someone who is visually impaired is using a screen reader to read this out, imagine each one of these words being read out loud in a monotone without any pauses between sentences, because the original diary does not actually have a lot of punctuation. It's really, really hard when I've done this to hear what's going on, to make sense of any of this. Another problem that we run into with these kinds of primary source transcriptions that are verbatim, that are kind of diplomatic, is full text search, right? If you have an irregular spelling, you're probably not going to find that if you're just doing a straightforward full text search, because if I search for Stony Point as a place name, I'm not going to find Stony Pint, that is an ear spelling that the diarist used. So another example of this from earlier documents, these are documents at the Folger Shakespeare Library's Early Modern Manuscripts Online. And this is something that we thought was going to be great to use for training. So we want to show kind of how they've addressed this problem. So they are working with early modern manuscripts, which are from roughly contemporary with Shakespeare. And you can see this letter they've transcribed using a diplomatic transcription, which means they are trying to preserve everything as much as possible. So so which is abbreviated W with CH, with W with TH. February at the very last line has 2 Fs instead of a capital F. This would also present a lot of problems for screen readers. This is also a challenge. So what they're doing is that they have staff who regularize this. So on their website, you've got a diplomatic transcription, and you can switch over to a regularized transcription that does things like expand out all the whiches and the widths and gives us a capital F for February in that last line. So this, you can take a look at the example of the differences and how easy or hard they are to read. You have weird spellings like very, V-E-R-I-E. Well, the Folger staff, for their regularized transcription, have turned that into V-E-R-Y, right? So this is a process in which you have library staff who are paraphrasing primary sources for the purpose of access. Okay, so our experiment was, can we do that same process, that regularization for access, using ChatGPT? Can we use that large language model to take these diplomatic transcripts and regularize them for people to read, right? So Our process was we fed the diplomatic transcripts to ChatGPT, we prompted it to regularize the text, and then the experiment portion of this was to compare the results that ChatGPT gave us against the results that were created by the Folger Shakespeare Library staff. So here are the results, right? So we start with a diplomatic transcription, and we ask ChatGPT to regularize it. And I've got to say, it's pretty good, right? If you look at that last line, Blithfield, the 27th of February, 1595, it has taken the Roman numerals for 27th and changed that to Arabic numerals. It has added a comma where we would have a comma. It's changed the double F for February into a capital F. This is something you could point a screen reader at. This is something that you could hand to a student who is not used to this. It's even
lordship.
It's definitely great. So if you look at the third to last line, which I hope by your lordship's good means will be prevented. Well, the original has an abbreviation, LPS, which is apparently an abbreviation for lordships. That's not an abbreviation that I'm familiar with. I'm not sure if I could make sense of this unless I had had a lot of experience reading that, and it did a fine job. So how does this compare against the version that the Folger Shakespeare Library staff did? So looking at the two of these, they're almost the same. There's a little bit of additional regularization of the punctuation that the ChatGPT model did. There are cases in which you have stylistic differences. So if you look at the end of the fourth line or the beginning of the fifth line to one Thomas Rathbone, innkeeper there at the sign of the crown, who breaking them up in the Folger Shakespeare Library version, that was changed into two separate sentences. So the ChatGPT, I brought them to this person at the sign of the crown, he breaking them up and perusing the content sent them to me. So it's breaking up one of these early modern kind of run-on sentences, but the content is the same, right? It's more readable, and I'm not sure that preserving that run-on sentence is a service to somebody using a screen reader or to a modern reader. So we're pretty impressed. Now, how did we get that? What prompt did we use? We had to do a handful of revisions to this, and what we ended up coming up with that we liked the best was one that involved the same kind of role playing and instruction. So we said, you are a librarian who makes primary sources more accessible to the public, right? So we're trying to tell it who it is. And then we have context. I'll give you the text of the letter written in early modern English containing non-standard spelling and punctuation. Please create a regularized version of the text which can be read easily by the modern researcher. So this is where we're asking for the output. We're saying a modern researcher needs to read this, and you're going to regularize it. And then we provided it the text. I think this is pretty impressive. I think it's interesting as a way to make more primary sources available to more users, because it means that the institution posting the primary sources may not need to do this. This might be something that screen readers might be able to do, is to ask these large language models to paraphrase difficult text for them. And with the correct prompts, I think they're going to get a much better experience than we currently have.
But let's not forget this prompt has to be really good.
Yes, yes, right. We will say that the first versions of it, when we just said regularize this text, rather than right honorable my very good lord, we got dear lord. Well, I don't think anyone is going to read that correctly. We also saw examples of it over-correcting some things. 2 miles on this side of the town of Nantwich was paraphrased to close to the town of Nantwich. Well, that you're losing information there. So again, the prompt is really important.
So those are the examples we had for you today. We are happy to take questions, to have a discussion. We've got a ChatGPT interface open if we want to do some experiments. If you go to the next slide, so we will send out this webinar to everyone who signed up as a recording. It takes us usually a couple days to get that done. We do webinars at least once a month. The only one we have scheduled right now is one on crowdsourcing, your first crowdsourcing project in August. But in the upcoming months, we'll have one. Actually, Isabella, our research intern, will be doing one with us on what her research has been and what she's learned. She's been doing a lot of experiments trying to get ChatGPT to pretend it's a 19th century plantation owner or abolitionist, and seeing where the limitations of the model are and what it's willing to say. We've got one coming up that I'm working on getting scheduled on Whisper AI for audio resources. Will Hicks at the University of North Texas Libraries has done a really interesting project on that. He's going to come talk to us about it. And then we'll do one on this bot that I'm building, that a lot of the examples that I gave came from with a primary source transcribed archival document. So we have a lot coming up, just none of them are scheduled. So watch that URL at the bottom.
So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to take questions, starting with the questions in the chat. So the question is, how is ChatGPT reviewing the collections? Are you directing it to the web pages? And I believe that came in during the classification. So there are plugins that you can use on ChatGPT that ask it, let it fetch a web page and parse it. Those are only available with GPT-4, and they're only available to people who have paid subscriptions. We also are finding them a little bit challenging in that the results that they return do not seem, in many cases, to reflect the PDFs that we're pointing them at.
We tried to do some examples for this, and we were like, let's not go here.
Yeah, one of these days, I think that these would be fantastic for taking printed, legacy finding aids and creating EAD finding aids out of them. But that's not working yet. If it is, we have not figured out how to do that.
So, and the short answer to Justin is, for these experiments, we just copy and pasted stuff in. We have a spreadsheet of titles and descriptions, and we were trying them one at a time. But all those experiments are informing what we might choose to do, like within from the page as programmatically.
Right. Sarah's chatbot that she's building already is doing these prompts using
API access.
So she has a script that's doing this prompt. So it can be done automatically as well.
And it's not that hard.
So there's another question. Which version of ChatGPT was used for these examples? All of my examples were GPT 3.5.
All mine were too. Yeah.
Right.
So that's the free one. So everything that you saw today, you have access to for free using chat.openai.com.
One of the things that we have observed, not in terms of differences between GPT 3.5 and GPT 4, but differences between individual updates to GPT 3.5, is that the ethical guardrails that OpenAI is putting around ChatGPT have made it, in many cases, very difficult to work with sensitive historical materials relating to slavery. ChatGPT just does not want to talk about slavery at all. And a lot of times you'll ask it to take a primary source or do something from a certain voice, and it will give you a lecture about slavery being evil instead.
Yes, which we know.
Yes. Right.
But there are some, we found some ways to kind of push it in different directions to get better.
But we're seeing different responses on a week-by-week basis as they continue to tweak those guardrails.
Yeah.
Would we have an example of using ChatGPT to clean up legacy archival descriptive metadata? We don't have one right now, but we would be really interested in experimenting with one. That fits in really well with some of the things we were talking about trying to do of taking print finding aids and converting them into EAD. If you wouldn't mind, if you'd be interested in sending us one of your examples.
Or if you can, if we have time, which we got 15 minutes left, find one and we'll see if we can play with it at the end of this call. But if we can't do it at the end of this webinar, we can do it via email. That would be fun.
Do we change our prompts at all based on the model or version you're using?
No. The prompts all say, like, I think prompt engineering keeps getting more sophisticated, and we follow one person who mostly is a YouTube channel. It's called All About AI, but he does a great job of watching the research coming out about interacting with large language models and some of the other AI models, and he's got, ChatGPT based workflows that like summarize PDFs and pull out the useful stuff, and then he tries it and shares it with folks. And so that's a lot of how we're learning most of what we've learned. But he hasn't really said that there's a lot of differences based on the models.
Okay, question. If we successfully convert a document into EAD using ChatGPT, I'd love to see another webinar devoted just to that topic.
Okay, yeah.
Others would be interested in seeing conversion to other formats. So we have been very impressed with ChatGPT's, like, the reason we're interested in doing this is because, we've seen examples and we've created examples of taking dirty OCR and producing structured records out of it. We've seen this for biological specimen labels, being able to convert the OCR of a specimen label into valid Darwin core JSON. We've seen the same thing, taking OCR of title pages and trying to create mods or METS records out of those. I've even been able to see take a historic brewing recipe and convert it into the beer XML format that's used by home brewing systems. That said, that kind of paraphrase could also introduce errors. What we're finding is that what it's producing is grammatically correct. So the brewing recipe that it's producing is with the beer XML is great, but all the quantities are wrong. And they change from question to question. So we're still learning more about that.
Okay, there's a question. It would be wonderful to have a way to collaborate or talk with other archivists who are doing this, especially since ChatGPT and AI is developing so quickly. Do we know of any forums or groups? So the group that I belong to and follow is AI for LAM, L-A-M. And we'll try to pull, let me write a note down. We'll send that out in the email that we do the follow-up on. You can also Google it, and they've got a Slack group and they do a monthly community call. They tend to be more technical. I know that they grew out of sort of their organizational structure is very similar to the IIIF organizational structure, which I think they'll eventually start having community groups that are kind of focused on different areas. And so saying, hey, we'd really like to have a place for archivists to talk about stuff, they might be amenable to. Are we seeing discussions on like Digital Library Forum or,
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. We're doing a lot of our own experimentation and are kind of heads down.
Right. If you find some, or if you want to like share them or have, we're happy to talk about this with a lot of people. So facilitated discussions, or maybe we do birds of a feather at different regional archives groups, things like that I think would be interesting and fun and maybe a good place to start.
Okay. Layla says, I've had trouble finding the right prompt to get GPT to identify words and phrases that differ across two versions of a document. I was trying to get a list, but instead got a stylistic analysis. Do we have suggestions? So what that sounds like to me is the kind of task that would traditionally be done by a code differencing tool. And I think that there are two paths that I might consider following. One is to think about the traditional tools, non-AI tools that might do this. So one of them is a tool called diff, D-I-F-F. And if you prompted it to say, I'm looking for the differences between these two pieces of text, please create the same kind of output that diff would create. An alternative would be to say, use the phrase collating, right? To say, I'm trying to compare these two versions the same way that a Hinman collator would do.
I don't know whether it will work, and here's why. these large language models are very good at writing forward. They are not as good at looking backwards. And so it'll hold context, but you're asking it to kind of hold two contexts at the same time, document 1 and document 2. And it doesn't really have a way to do that. Like there are some people who are setting up kind of competing interactions, like where you have a writer and an editor, and they'll go back and forth, but those are almost two different sets of context, and they're running them as two sets of context. One of the experiments that Isabella did was asking it to generate some poetry based on certain rhyme schemes. And so, you know, you got AB rhyme schemes, right? But we were like, okay, well, what about an AABB rhymes? Actually, we had AABBC.
Yeah, we had a lot of different rhyme schemes. All it could do was AABB. That's all it would produce.
Not
like if you said, generate AAC BBC, right, a 6-line stanza, it still only created 4-line stanzas.
Yeah, it was pretty bad. So yeah, I don't know. There are limitations. There are some people who are smarter than we are who probably have figured out how to do some of this, but we haven't yet.
Okay, there's a lot of interest in legacy metadata cleanup.
Okay, yeah.
Question: have we experimented with BARD? No.
I haven't. Nope.
Me neither.
My original assumption was that Google's large language models would be better than a lot of other people, because I feel like it has a better representation of, has more knowledge, right? Crawls more of the web, has more Google books, all of these other sorts of things. So I probably should go do those experiments. But what I've seen said since then is the models themselves there's not a lot of difference, and there's not a lot of things that keep one model from not leveraging things that are coming out of other models. And so, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, we should try to play with that.
So more interest on deriving metadata from OCR. We will definitely be doing a lot more work with that. One of the things that we are trying to do is figure out how to use dirty OCR output or dirty HTR output to direct people to material they're interested in our case, so that they can transcribe or correct it.
There's also the AI for LAM group had a month ago a presentation by somebody at the Smithsonian, and they were taking OCR of historic Smithsonian, they were called bulletins. It was basically an annual document that listed all their accessions, and they were using GPT models to pull out metadata from each of those accession records, which was super fascinating. I will put a note to put that in the follow-up as well.
So Nat asks if we played with ChatGPT to describe historical images using a controlled vocabulary like the tags we used in our example, and what's the error rate. So we haven't used ChatGPT for that. There is, that seems more of a computer vision.
Okay, so ChatGPT version 3.5 and version 4 is pure text. Text in, text out. There is a ChatGPT 4.0 plus images that will take image in and text out. So that's the first statement, is there's that. The second statement is, yeah, I see Lydia from the Library of Virginia on. They're experimenting with some things around image generation from historic text. So maybe at some point we can get them to come talk about that. We shall see.
Do we know if ChatGPT or another AI can analyze AV material and create tags?
Well, that's fascinating.
So I feel like, again, there's two approaches to that. One of those is this kind of distant viewing approach, where you're having it look at the images. The other approach is one that I think we'll talk about when he presents on Whisper AI, and that he's using Whisper AI at the Portal to Texas History to create transcripts of AV material, sermons, broadcasts. And one part of his presentation talks about taking those transcripts and feeding those to ChatGPT to try to come up with subject headings and other kinds of other kinds of classification. So that's kind of a two-step process in which you're feeding the transcripts in rather than feeding the pure AV material in.
And we do find with a lot of kind of this library data creation, if you think in a pipeline, text in, ask for, I'm trying to think, like, don't go directly from source to the output I want. Go from source to the thing that you would look at as a human, to the thing you would write as a human, to the output that you want. Like, think of it as a pipeline, and you need to ask the models to go through kind of the same pipeline steps you would do if you were doing this yourself.
Another question, does it recognize other languages? The answer is yes. We've seen some pretty good examples with German. One of the things that I'm really excited about is that we can use it to take really bad, low quality HTR text or OCR text and identify the language of the original document. So for us, that means we might be able to point French language speakers at French language documents to work on. I've seen a couple of graphs about the material, how good the GPT models are on different languages. So some of them it's better than others. There was another presentation at the AI for Lamb group from the National Library of Norway talking about how it's not good at Sami, which is one of their like third or fourth most popular language in Norway, right? So, but it was great at bookmeld, like which was
so,
like what most of their texts would be. Would have been it.
Bob asks, yes, github.com AI for Lamb. That's their GitHub organization. There's also, I think if you just do aiforlamb.org, try that and see if that gets you where, because that's where they have information. Yeah, sites. Yes, there you go. Thank you.
So Sarah Palmer, the dialogue aspect of ChatGPT that remembers previous questions is quite useful. How do you leverage this when using the API? Does each request to the API need all the context, or can it learn from successive requests? That's a great question.
I don't know the answer to this yet. Here's what I know. So I know that in the last like week and a half, 2 weeks, okay, so how much context a query to these models can have is called the context window. If you've read some of the like really early articles where like New York Times reporters and it starts going off the rails and getting really weird, it's because it loses the earlier part of the conversation, because the context window at that time was only 4K tokens, so 4,000 words basically. In the last 2 weeks, that context window limitation has gone up to 16,000 words, which is a lot more. Or 16,000 tokens, but let's just say they're words. So that's super interesting. So what some of the experiments we're doing with this bot I'm trying to build is how much data can we feed it to answer questions about primary source documents. But Sarah, I don't know the answer about the API interactions and whether it keeps that context. And I need to go figure that out because I just don't know.
Okay, so we have like half a minute left, so let's end with Bob's question about where the webinar.
We'll email it out. It'll be on our YouTube channel, but we'll email out a link to everybody who's signed up for this.
Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate all of the great questions. This is fantastic. And definitely send us email if you have ideas for experiments that you'd like to try, you'd like us to try, you just want to talk about. We're all still figuring this stuff out, and it's fascinating, and the more the merrier.